Welcome back to Software Without Borders. I'm Tomas Hilliard, Director of Strategy for Accelerants.
And I'm Olivier Poulard, CTO and Managing Director of Software Strategies at Accelerants. Today we're joined by Steve Petersen, a fractional CTO and strategic technology advisor with a very strong track record on helping early stage companies to scale.
So our guest Steve today has spent his career at the intersection of SaaS, AI, and health tech, turning 0 to 1 ideas into real scalable products. Steve Petersen is the co-founder and CTO of Rift and a fractional CTO and strategic technology advisor to seed and A-stage companies, helping founders align tech strategies with business goals and navigate the chaos of rapid growth. Before Rift, Steve co-founded multiple startups, including Playlist and Jam Music, led engineering and data teams building next-generation biosensors and healthcare analytics, and shipped software that's lived inside 5 generations of iPods. He holds multiple patents across AI, data science, medical devices, and IoT, and has collaborated with industry leaders like Apple and NVIDIA to build high-performing systems in high-velocity environments. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So we'll just jump right into the question, Steve. You've spent your career helping seed the A-stage companies navigate rapid growth. What are the biggest challenges these companies face, and what's your approach to guiding them through those challenges?
That's a really, really good question. So a lot of times working with small companies, they tend to adopt the persona of the CEO. You guys might be familiar with that kind of, but a lot of times a startup CEO will call me and basically say, we're not moving fast enough. I don't understand why. I don't understand what my engineering team is telling me. I don't really have a good translation between the engineering kind of bits and the business bits. And so the challenge, I think, for a lot of these startups, especially if there's a non-technical founder, is bridging the gap between the technology and the business goals and the business value. And a lot of times that starts right at the top. I mean, one of my favorite things to say is that agile development is not an engineering practice, it's a business practice. And if the whole company is not doing agile, then nobody's doing agile, really. So, a lot of CEOs will bring somebody in and they'll say, "Oh yeah, we're doing agile. The engineering team's doing agile," but the C staff and the CEO is largely just off the rails, if you will. And a lot of times the challenge is to basically tell the CEO, "Hey, the reason that you're not moving fast enough is because your product definition process," which largely in these small companies, a lot of times the CEO is the product person because the CEO's got the vision, the product vision. So those two roles are kind of collapsed into one. And a lot of times the CEO doesn't have the discipline to kind of keep on a sprint schedule. If you're running a sprint of 2 weeks, typically what will happen in these startups is the CEO will get some signal from an investor, mid-sprint, and they'll change their minds and they'll basically want to change the direction of the engineering team. And that churn largely goes unnoticed because, it's kind of coming from the top. And so, what I tell my clients who are interested in agile transformations is be ready to hear some kind of things that you might not want to hear, which are, hey, this is kind of coming from the top. Your inability to deliver, your slowness to deliver, a lot of times comes from churn at the product and the C staff level. That's a hard pill to swallow, and it's also hard for some of these CTOs or CEOs to, get that discipline to say, okay, I'm going to give my engineering team the amount of time they need to execute on that priority that we had established, at the beginning of the sprint.
So I've seen this many times, Steve. You're absolutely right. And then I would add one little thing. So I completely agree. It's a business practice. It's not an engineering practice, but it's a mindset as well. So I think
Definitely.
It goes with your approach of being a business practice, but it's not just, if we use the term practice, I think sometimes it can be misconstrued. But mindset is, I think, the key word. And then you mentioned something else that I was going to say, discipline. Amazingly enough, Agile requires a lot more discipline than Waterfall.
Yes.
You've seen this, right? Because it becomes
absolutely.
chaotic very, very, very quickly. Very quickly.
Yeah. So Agile tends to handle dependencies in real time, and that's kind of one of the main kind of goals, is to not try to plan things out, but to do that. To your point, Olivier, you need the discipline to be able to work those dependencies out in real time, and adjust, based on the things that you find, and that takes a lot of, to your point, takes a lot of discipline, takes a lot of work and practice.
And agile doesn't mean saying yes to everything and changing left and right, because I've seen this. I mean, that's change management is a key function, I would say, a key practice, if you want to call it this way, in agile, especially, right?
It's almost the other way around, isn't it? It's like it's better to say no more times than you say yes, and that's what one of the things I love about agile is, if done correctly, it empowers the engineers to be their own managers and to be part of the management process, and if a workflow order change or whatever comes in mid sprint, you basically allow the engineers to say no. It's like, we can't do that and meet the original goals. And that's a very, very powerful tool, to keep discipline throughout the whole company.
Really interesting, Steve. So, what I'm hearing is that you come in and you help align the technology and process to the desired business outcomes and kind of the vision of what the business has in the first place. A segue from that, aligning technology with business outcomes, everyone's talking about AI these days, and that's an area that you have a specific background in. I'd like to hear more about what excites you the most of the current state of AI, and how do you help companies leverage AI to drive impactful solutions?
Great question. I mean, I think there's two major areas. One is obviously in product definition, and SaaS is really going from a per seat model to a kind of transactional model where you're paying for an interaction with an AI, and those are kind of sea changes to product and SaaS, that have to be negotiated and managed, and so maybe we could put a pin in that for a second and come back to that. But the other area that is really, really exciting, obviously, is in AI tools to support development teams, and there's a lot of hype in both of those places. But talking about the engineering teams, specifically first, the way that I use AI in engineering is in things like code review. An AI code review can find kind of traditional programming bugs or inconsistencies a lot more consistently than a human being can in a lot less time. So there's a huge ROI on using AI for code reviews, and part of those processes that are checking, the checks and balances, the normal checks and balances you have in an engineering team. So what I usually do, like for clients, is that I'll require an engineer to do an AI code review, or have Copilot, GitHub Copilot do a code review prior to my code review. So as soon as it passes the AI code review, then I know that it's both syntactically, semantically correct, and following programming guidelines and such. And I don't have to look at that. When I do the code review as a CTO, I'm looking for architectural failures. Say somebody puts a reference to or a dependency on a backend system like Redis in the UI. That's a big fundamental problem. That's the thing that I look at, and I can focus on those things, knowing that the lower level coding has been validated already, by basically these days what amounts to an expert, in the language.
Yeah, I'm curious because you've now identified an area where you think AI has reached a point to help create efficiencies in software development. What are some of the areas of software development where you still think that AI is not ready to be fully implemented within our processes?
Great question. So the other place in development kind of framework that I use AI is, like GitHub Copilot in VS Code. It's kind of on the right hand pane. It's there. You can use it, effectively, to understand the code base in ways that would take you a long time, a human being a long time. So I do recommend that every engineer uses something like GitHub Copilot to answer questions while they're programming. It also does an extremely good job, I think, of doing lower level boilerplate code. Things like logging statements, which in an uncompiled language or untype checked language, a human being can make small errors that cost a lot in terms of time. Especially if you make a change, you deploy that change, there's a bug, you're like, oh my gosh, I screwed up that logging statement. That's kind of the worst case scenario. So I encourage engineers to use AI for boilerplate, for kind of utility functions and things like that. I did a study for one client that showed that you can get 30% increase in efficiency at the development level if you use it that way. The thing that I don't really like yet is there's a lot of hype around vibe coding, and this idea that you can kind of create a product without a software engineer. I think we're still maybe years away from that. Not too many years. It could be next year, it could be the year after. I think progress is exponential now. But the problem with vibe coding that I see is that, and some of this is anecdotal, so the trends may be emerging at this point, but the problem with vibe coding is that you can have the AI write a bug that the developer does not understand. Very, very tough situation, because then all of a sudden the developer has to go in and debug that thing. It could be quite a bit obscure in the bug, and it just takes them time to figure out what the AI did. So we want to avoid those kinds of situations that are causing more work for engineers, and focus the AI in the spaces that the AI is really, really good at. This is all changing. A year from now, it's going to be completely different. I think the future is that AI is going to be doing most of the coding. These systems are getting better and better.
But for that to happen, I will tell you one thing. I'm absolutely convinced that human beings will have to be much, much better at specifying what they want, which is not the case today. If you think about it, human to human, we have a problem anyway where, okay, the product manager will venture an idea and barely document it. Again, it's not documentation for the sake of documentation, but a minimum is needed to have a proper design and a proper understanding of what the problem statement is, because the engineers need to solve a solution, needs to solve the problem with a solution, but the solution is never adequate if it's fixing the wrong problem, because the problem is misunderstood.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. It's really interesting in my own use of AI. I've stopped writing complete documents, and I write bullet points and let the AI kind of flesh out around those bullet points. So there are pros and cons in that approach. I think, if you get those bullet points wrong, so that the pros are potentially that you have a much more concise definition of the product. And if you have been in Agile and you know what a kind of an executable user story sounds like, you can write user stories and then flesh a PRD out from there. But you know that the user stories have been, kind of are very concise and vetted and already executable and verifiable. So there's that positive. I guess the negative would be is that if you allow the AI to do too much in that product definition, AI still hallucinate, LLMs still hallucinate, and you end up, if you generate a 40-page document, then you're spending a lot of time trying to figure out, what the AI did wrong. And you end up in that same kind of situation as the programmer, where you've got to go and figure out what it did wrong, instead of kind of using it to generate what's correct. So yeah, I think that my sense is that right now, at least, we need humans in the loop, at the product definition stage, at the coding stage. I think that's the right way to go.
Yeah, and in fact, simply, as long as humans are involved with the solution, using it or not, the humans will be involved anyway. Unless a machine uses whatever the machine creates, that's a different story. But who is going to buy the products? Who is going to use the services? Human beings in general, right?
I think the big benefit to me, and this kind of, and Olivia, I know you understand this because you have kind of similar background to me, is that we started out writing microcode,
Yeah.
and you're coding at such a low level.
Yeah.
You're thinking in terms of ands and ors and nors and xors and all these machine instructions. Then you have to tie all those things together to perform real work. So your level of abstraction 20 years ago was so low that it was very difficult to build systems that were huge and big. It took huge teams, and if you look at the defense industry, very long development cycles, and very, very bulletproof QA. The AI, as languages have developed over time, your level of abstraction goes up and up, and you get to think about bigger things and bigger topics, and let the machine do the kind of grunge work underneath. And I look at AI as kind of the same thing. It's letting, it's going back to my bullet points thing. I can now think about bullet points instead of trying to create a document that another person will understand. I'm at a higher level of abstraction in that process, and that lets me be more creative, lets me be kind of more thorough, because I think humans get exhausted with details, and you start out like with a bang, and you end up at the end of the PRD going, okay, what I'm talking about, that kind of hand wavy thing. So it lets us kind of focus on higher level abstraction and have the machine, if you will, putting in that detail in underneath it. And I think that's a super, valuable thing, in the evolution of software development or product development.
This is really interesting, Steve. I'm seeing a theme around you helping companies obviously become more efficient. First, we talked about creating alignment between the technology and the business outcomes. Second, it's creating efficiencies by using AI in the right places within your software development lifecycle. So I kind of want to round out the conversation. What other critical factors for building scalable systems and infrastructure, especially for SaaS businesses experiencing rapid growth? What else can you say about areas of efficiency to be found within those?
Just getting back to process for a second, the what I like to do is again going back to this idea that agile is a business process. I'd like to have a really, really good process up at the top of the company for defining business value. And what I do is I try to percolate that or propagate that business value understanding all the way from the top of the company down into the engineering team. And then you measure, instead of measuring like feature velocity or coding velocity or lines of code, what I like to do is measure business value velocity. Okay. And so to measure business value velocity, you have to have an end-to-end system that is based on business value. So, what I end up doing with a lot of my clients is I come in and I help define, and I have a spreadsheet for this. It's a very, very straightforward thing that says stack rank your features based on business value. You get your product stakeholder team to vote on those. So you get a really strong signal on business value. And then you drive that business value into the engineering team. So the engineers are aware. So for example, if you've got Jira, if you're using Jira as a ticket management system, you've got a tag on that story of what the business value is. And then you ship against that business value. The engineering team reports against that business value, and the product stakeholder team measures how well the whole company has executed against business value. And this kind of process gives you a huge amount of power because you can derive a lot of things from that. You basically start saying our business value velocity is too low. Why? Well, is it a product definition problem? Is it an execution, like an engineering execution problem? But without that metric, you're kind of awash in, too much data, not enough, you don't really understand why. But if you've got this kind of business value based process, then you can measure that and make changes, including hiring and firing signals. If you find that your team's velocity against the business value that you've established is too low, maybe you've got the wrong engineers. And over a couple of sprints, you can say, hey, we've got too many UI engineers. We don't have any UI. Our business value is not tied up in our user interface. yet we have 3 or 4 UI engineers. That's a mismatch in that can be optimized for the business value that the company needs. So that's kind of the way I look at these things.
Yeah, I have the exact same method. I In business value, I assume that you include the perceived value from a client perspective, actually from
Yeah,
the business perspective, and the
yeah,
operations, right? So
yeah,
it's all three. It's not just because I want to make sure we understand business as the whole thing,
yeah.
right? Okay.
Totally,
And
totally. Yeah.
yeah, I do the exact same thing, but I normalize it over cost. And
Oh,
my
okay. Interesting.
yeah, yeah, because you could have two items of the same business value. Let's say low business value, okay, it's gone. But
Yeah,
same high business value. But then how do you prioritize, right? So
yeah.
you've got to be careful because sometimes, a high business value with a high cost might not be as interesting as a high business value over a low cost. And again, assuming that you have a method that you can rely on determining what the cost is from a development standpoint, from an implementation standpoint, and from a transition standpoint. So it's not just engineering itself, because that is typically the very low part of the cost, right? So the implementation can be costly. The transition to that new feature or new product can be extremely costly as well. So all this has to be taken into account, and you need to, of course, to have a reliable method of estimating, all those three costs. Obviously, to have a purely normalized way of comparing those business values.
I like that. I think when I do it, I think more in terms of time than costs, but they're very highly correlated.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because time to me is also a cost, but from a different perspective. I The time to me would be about the cost of losing or not making revenue.
Opportunity costs,
That's right.
certainly.
That's
Yeah,
exactly it.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
how I.
Agreed.
That's why to me time. I don't mention time because time is in the cost, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. It's just a different way to look at it, but I think we're
Yeah,
saying
but
pretty
it's
much
all
the
the same.
same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, sometimes startups will do, and this is the difference between bigger and smaller companies. Sometimes startups will do things that cost a lot, just to get business, get that initial product market fit, and a lot of that cost is like you said, it's opportunity costs, but it's time to market. It needs to be fast. It needs to get, it might cost a lot, but it needs to get to the market quick to get validation, to get that kind of learning opportunity, learning what your customers really want, and did the work that we did it actually satisfy the customer's demand, or that kind of thing.
So, Steve, your expertise clearly spans SaaS product development and AI integration. I'm curious as to how you see these two areas intersecting and driving innovation for businesses.
Yeah, I think I touched a little bit about the kind of cost model for SaaS. I think it's going to change. There are articles about this. I try to track as much as possible. What's happening. Other kind of industry experts on this, but what I see is that the kind of per seat model where you're paying monthly for a seat, is probably going to go away. It might be already going away, and I've tried to kind of teach my clients, hey, this is what's on the horizon. You're kind of paying per interaction with the system, and that system is, if it's an AI or an LLM or an agentic system, you're really paying for kind of the compute for that interaction. And this is, I think, interesting because well, there are ramifications. I think you tend to lose the kind of the subscription model, where you're getting a fixed, monthly, revenue, for a somewhat more variable monthly revenue for a startup. So that can be a little bit harrowing for a CEO or a founder that's used to saying, hey, I've got n number of clients and they're all paying $200 a month, and so I've got a good reliable fixed revenue. So the revenue could go up and down, but if you're satisfying the customer's desires or needs better, then you could argue that that pricing model just allows the customer to stick around longer. So your long-term value goes up, for a customer rather than going down. And ideally churn would go down, and churn is kind of the thing you want to avoid, in a SaaS product. So I think those are the kinds of things that right now SaaS companies need to be thinking about is, you sacrifice a little bit of consistency on income or revenue for better long-term value, customer long-term value.
I was going to ask, regardless of technology, we talked about SaaS products. So what are the main challenges to define and then implement and provide SaaS products on the market?
Yeah, the biggest kind of challenge that I see is really defining product market fit. SaaS products tend to have two buyers. They have a buyer who's actually cutting the check for the product. Could be somebody in the financial, kind of department. Could be, a business person. Then they've got the user, and those two value propositions are tightly coupled but different. You're trying to get the purchaser to buy this thing, because maybe there's an ROI story that you can make for the business, but you're also trying to get the features that the end user will use, and you've got to satisfy both of those buyers. Very typical in a SaaS, kind of deployment. A lot of times, companies, especially early stage companies, go in with a very relatively kind of seat of the pants or gut feeling on product market fit. They don't necessarily realize that there are two buyers in the system, that you have to kind of work with. And so they get less than perfect product market fit. And then everything kind of falls apart from there. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge is taking a good amount of time to really understand what your customers want, really understand who's writing the check and why they're writing the check, and making sure testing those things out, potentially even with like a no code type solution. And this, getting back to the AI thing, this is potentially where I think AI could help be super, super helpful, because in the product market fit, kind of iteration, ideally you would do no code, kind of proofs of concept, so that you can iterate and learn very, very quickly. I see an opportunity for AI to make those, and this is maybe where the vibe coding thing could come in. It doesn't have to be perfect, which is good because AIs are not perfect, at the coding right now, but it could be enough to validate, a hypothesis around product market fit. And if you can get that iteration to happen fast, then you end up starting development when you're actually cutting code with a much, much more firm understanding of what your product needs to do.
And just to finish on this SaaS topic, from an architectural standpoint, is there anything that you would recommend to other CTOs or?
Yeah, I mean, the best I think advice is to try to stick to industry standard functionality or building blocks.
Yeah.
I tend to be a little bit more open source oriented. I don't always like to go with like the full AWS solution with Cognito and API bridges and all the things that there's. I have a tendency to go a little bit more open source, so I'll integrate a library that does, single sign-on instead of using Cognito. But both approaches are, I think, technically feasible. I think there are some downrange considerations to which one you pick. The both of those I think are good solutions, potential solutions in the shorter term that can get a startup from kind of from that 0 to 1 destination. The thing you want to avoid is trying to roll your own where there are existing solutions out there, and a lot of times what I see is that companies that are engineering driven instead of product driven or business driven, you've got a technologist down there in the team that says, I know exactly what to do. I'm going to build my own SSO system. And you're like, the CEO is like, I don't really understand the ramifications of that statement, but this guy's smart. I know he's smart. He can code. I'm going to let him run with that. And those are the kinds of decisions that I like to get involved early with a company to avoid. What I tell a lot of my clients is, look, even as a fractional, and especially as a fractional, I think we can talk about the kind of economics of fractional, leadership, but being there to stop that decision in its tracks is like the most valuable thing that I can do for an early client. Is once they go down that road where they're starting to build their own technology, they absolutely will slow down relative to their competition. And those are the things. Those are potentially fatal, flaws that you can avoid, early with good, kind of fractional CTO leadership.
I have a way of saying it. I think hopefully that will resonate. It's not about reinventing the wheel; it's about making the wheel better. So there are already wheels out there. Just see which ones you need, which ones you don't need, assemble them, but keep it lean as well. From an architecture standpoint, I think lean is typically associated with process and that kind of stuff. I use lean everywhere. Organization, the people, the process, the technology, and the data. Keep things very, very close. Keep things, trim the complexity, not to become simplistic, but to become simple. Simple things work. Complex stuff, they're costly, difficult to manage, operate, etc. So anyway, but
I totally agree with you.
Hey, Steve, something you touched on in reading through your website, something that stood out to me was the economics of fractional CTO work. Can you kind of make the pitch for fractional CTO work, and what different outlook or perspective might they bring than hiring a full-time CEO?
Well, it's a really, really good question. Obviously, dear to my heart. I've spent some time thinking about this, but there are investors who really want to have the CTO have skin in the game, and that's a big thing. The big question you get from an early stage investor is, how do we know they're going to stick around? Are they properly incentivized, strategically incentivized? And so. There's also this tendency, so that's one kind of aspect. There's also a tendency for a startup to hire the cheapest labor that they can get. And what I see a lot of, and I see this a lot, is they'll hire an engineer and say, he's a pretty smart engineer, I'm going to make him a CTO, and we'll groom him for that role. And a lot of times what I see is that they spend 150K, they get a developer. That developer doesn't have good strategic vision, never been a CTO before, never been in a board meeting before, and so they don't really understand the business, the business aspects of the decisions that they're making. And sometimes they're just, they're misguided. Maybe they do have this kind of build instead of buy, because they want to assert themselves as a technical leader, so they'll build stuff, and so they just don't have the perspective that a longer term CTO has. And so I see a lot of these kinds of CTOs flame out because they've made decisions that put the company in a bind. Then they're like, they kind of bring me in to clean up a little bit, so let's just look at that 150K, right? You take a good Silicon Valley CTO is probably 300 to 400K. So they're trying to get a savings of 2x on their labor in this area. And what I suggest to them, and this is kind of my model, is, look, you don't need a full-time CTO if they're not coding. You need a full-time CTO if they're coding for a startup. But I've been very successful with that quarter-time model, where I'm hands-on with the engineering team, daily stand-ups, breakouts, architecture, product definition for the product team. That can be done in 40 hours a month instead of 160 hours a month. And in the worst case, 80 hours a month instead of 160 hours a month. So you're getting that cost savings, you're getting the strategic leadership, and you're not exposing the business to that risk of relying on a very green engineer to define technical strategy. And believe me, I've been the very green engineer, so I know this. My tendency as an engineer was to build it, I was excited
Cool
about
stuff.
that. I would build
The cool
stuff. I want to
stuff.
build stuff. Yeah, and as a CTO, I try not to build stuff. Right, to get the teams to buy stuff instead of build stuff. So it's but yeah, so that's really the argument.
And there's also a big risk of mixing strategy and the strategic aspect of the program, the tactical piece, right? So sometimes those younger CTOs full time being involved with strategy and the tactical will probably take shortcuts that in the short run will make the startup look very, very good. But in the long run, it will actually damage the business model, damage the products, the end user perspective, etc. So short term it works, short term gain for long term pain, I assume.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with making a decision that is short-term tactical, say to win a client. You got to do what you got to do in a startup. So sometimes those decisions need to be made, and sometimes they're the right decisions. But making that decision, knowing that it's a tactical solution,
That's what I was going to
is
say.
super.
Intentionally,
Yeah,
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 it has to be
super important.
intentional. That's the
Yeah,
difference.
it's intentional. And what I end up doing a lot is, if there's a choice between two technologies or two paths or whatever, and there's like a disagreement about which path to take, the best way that I've come across to do this, or to make this decision, is to say, okay, we're going to take path A instead of path B, but we need a timeline and an evaluation criteria for that, to say, when are we going to decide whether it works or not? Or whether it has worked, or whether it has been beneficial, and so if there is kind of a decision point where you're saying, we don't know what to do, we're going to do A or B. If you choose A and the rest of the team says, no, it's really B, you got to say basically, okay, we're going to choose A because I'm in charge of that response. I'm responsible for that decision. I'm going to make this decision, come up with a set of criteria that we can evaluate that decision very quickly, so we fail fast, so we don't go a year that we're struggling to make this thing work. We basically say, okay, we're going to give it a month. Here's the decision criteria by which we're going to say go or no go after that month, and then we switch gears, if it's not working.
So what I'm really hearing, Steve, is that the value proposition in hiring a fractional CTO is the experience that they bring in comparison to maybe the cheaper internal hire. So with that, you've worked with industry leaders like Apple and NVIDIA. What have you learned from these collaborations that you apply to your work with startups?
Well, I think those big companies, they tend not to be as agile as a smaller company, and this is kind of why I've stayed in the startup industry. Is that I kind of like there's a dynamicism, if you will, that I kind of enjoy. Um, I the big companies, I don't think they innovate as fast as a small company. I think even Zuckerberg said that in one of his posts, last year. They win by being, not to overuse the term agile, but being able to course correct quickly. And I think a lot of that is because the people who are on the hook, or the people who are interfacing with the customer and defining product, are the ones that are on the hook for the business. Like, going back to this idea that the CEO is largely, in these companies, the product owner in agile terminology. If something's not working, they are a founder, they are feeling that pain. And I think that in a larger company, that pain can be so removed, especially from the engineering team. Engineers don't, they're like, they told me to write this code, I'm going to write this code. They write the code, they ship it, and it's like, well, I wrote that code, and I have no idea whether, so that kind of feedback loop, accountability feedback loop, is so soft in larger companies, where it's very acute in a smaller company, and I like that. I actually enjoy that environment. So I'm not sure I answered your question very well, but you can probably tell that I don't really like the big company as much as I like the small company.
It's great. With experience also comes with knowing what doesn't work, and it seems like that's something that feedback loop is something that you are very intentional about creating within those startup communities.
It can be done. It can be done in large companies. I think Apple does do a good job of, kind of creating little tiger teams, if you will, that have that kind of accountability, and they'll apply that team to a problem, and make product. So the companies that do that well are the ones that can form sort of an entrepreneurial environment within this bureaucracy that is kind of keeping the company alive and whatever, they create a little entrepreneurial team, and that entrepreneurial team acts like a little startup, and they deliver, and that's a successful model.
And since we're talking about people, what do you think are the most important qualities when building a high performing tech team for a startup?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have an interview process that I've been using for decades, actually, where I'll go in. So just really briefly, I'll script out an interview for, like, when we're hiring people on a team. We'll make an interview team. I give those team members a very specific kind of domain in which they ask questions. So there'll be if it's a development engineer, software engineer, there'll be a QA engineer in the interview loop, a couple developers, in the same domain, maybe a developer that's different in a different domain, and then me. And so I basically say the QA engineer focus on their quality, their personal quality process. The development engineers, somebody's got to ask them some coding questions, somebody's got to ask them some architectural level questions. And then what I do is I give them an open-ended, in real time. I basically say, for example, I'm a restaurant owner. I want a restaurant reservation system. Go. And see what they do in real time and watch them think. And what I like to see is I like to see people who will say, okay, what do you want this system to do? Yeah. Okay, and start writing down use cases. Okay, do you have any performance requirements? So you get very quickly a signal on whether they can actually architect or whether they're a coder. If they start writing lines of code, you're like, okay, I know. It's not that they didn't pass the interview. It's that where in the engineering structure to put them effectively. They're going to enjoy, and a lot of times the things that they respond with are the things that they enjoy doing. And so you get a real sense of kind of what this person is going to be, motivated by, and where best in that organization to put them. And to your, kind of directly to your point, Olivier, building a team is like, and this is what excites me about, even more so than coding, is kind of constructing a team that'll actually work well together and resonate. And to get people to resonate together, they have to be personally motivated, and they have to be personally motivated and personally challenged. And so these interviews that I do kind of try to define where those people will best be to help the team resonate on a higher level. And then you kind of do this for everybody in the organization, and you get the structure that people are they're kicking ass in their own domain, and they're loving it, and that's how you get teams to really fire in all cylinders.
The same way you architect technical solutions, you should architect processes, ways of working. You should architect data, of course, that's pretty clear, but you should architect organizations as well, and based on the context, totally. Based on your needs, right? So it's you're acting as an architect essentially, as a leader.
Yep, exactly, and that's the challenge I think that I've kind of matured into or gravitated towards, or I'm not sure how to say that, but I used to get really excited about writing lines of code. Now I get excited about building teams that excel. I had a company called Vital Connect that I was a VP of software for, and I created a team of 12, and that's kind of a really nice sized team. But these guys, it was one of these things where I felt so good creating a culture where these people were thriving. And there's a little anecdote I'll tell. It was an FDA product. It was hardware and software. It was a heart rate patch and the associated software to get all of these. If you can imagine a nurse looking at a screen with 100 EKGs on the screen of all the patients that they're. So I was responsible for all that software, getting it up into the cloud, et cetera. But we had to get FDA approved. The software team beat the hardware team to FDA, and this was. We yelled so loud, the whole team yelled and screamed and was, whooping it up so loud that the CEO came out of his office and he's like, "What's going on?" And we were just whooping it up, and it was one of the best experiences in my career, because these people were motivated, they were excited, we worked well together, and it was just an absolutely fantastic experience.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that anecdote and for insights throughout this podcast, Steve. Your experience in scaling startups and driving innovation has been incredibly valuable. I want to give you the opportunity to plug yourself. Where can our listeners find you, either on socials or what website can they find you on?
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that, and it's been great talking to you guys. Really enjoyed it. And Livia, I know we kind of have a very similar background, and I think philosophy as well. It's nice to meet people who have kind of similar, ways of working and stuff. So it's been very nice and very fun to talk. Yeah. So my name is Steve Petersen. On LinkedIn, you can find me at SLP. That's the LinkedIn.in or /in/SLP. I've got a website that is Veria.ai, Veria.ai. That's the consulting group or the corporation that I've started. So you can find some information about me there. Obviously, in my LinkedIn, I do have a patent portfolio that you can browse if you're into that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I, again, work with seed to B, seed to A, anywhere there's but even in a B stage company that has an entrepreneurial kind of bent or opportunity, I would go into that as well.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing.
Excellent.
To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Software Without Borders. If you're interested in learning more about startup strategy, AI, or SaaS development, be sure to subscribe to our show and leave a 5-star rating on your favorite podcasting platform. Thanks again, Steve. Have a great day.